Some flowers for your mother." The cemetery caretaker's voice startled Emily from her trance. She clutched her bouquet of white lilies tighter and nodded, unable to find her voice. 3 years since her mother's passing, and the wound still felt raw, exposed to the elements. "Thank you," she finally managed, exchanging a few dollars for the small watering can he offered. A biting autumn wind swept across the cemetery grounds, sending dead leaves dancing between the headstones. Emily pulled her burgundy coat tighter around her shoulders, her boots crunching against the gravel path as she made her way toward the eastern section where her mother rested. The unexpected detour happened as she rounded the corner past the century-old oak. A figure kneeling in the distance, shoulders heaving with unmistakable sobs. Even from behind, Emily would recognize that steel-gray bob and rigid posture anywhere. Margaret, her mother-in-law. Emily froze mid-step, irrationally afraid the older woman might sense her presence. Why was Margaret here? Her late husband was buried in the Veterans Cemetery on the other side of town. Emily had accompanied Daniel to his father's grave many times. Curiosity overrode her instinct to retreat. Moving silently behind a large marble angel, Emily watched as Margaret placed a tiny teddy bear against a small headstone, her weathered hands trembling. The woman's normally immaculate appearance had crumbled. Her expensive cashmere coat was buttoned incorrectly, her hair disheveled by the wind. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring your favorite roses," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "The frost took them early this year." Emily strained to read the inscription on the small stone. It wasn't elaborate, just a simple marker with the words, "Beloved baby, never forgotten." Below it, a date from 47 years ago. The realization hit Emily like a physical blow. Margaret had lost a child, a baby, long before Daniel was born. For 6 years, Emily had endured Margaret's cold stares, cutting remarks, and thinly veiled disapproval. The woman had made it abundantly clear from the moment Daniel had introduced them, Emily would never be good enough for her son. "You're marrying beneath you," she'd overheard Margaret telling Daniel the night before their wedding. "She'll never understand our world, our traditions." Yet now, watching the formidable woman crumble before a tiny grave, Emily felt something shift inside her. The Margaret she knew, cold, judgmental, perfectly composed, had vanished, replaced by a broken mother mourning a loss so profound it had survived nearly 5 decades. Emily stepped back, intending to slip away unnoticed, when her heel caught on an exposed root. The noise was minimal, but in the cemetery's silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. Margaret's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face transforming instantly into a mask of fury when she spotted Emily. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice like ice despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. Emily stepped forward, abandoning pretense. "I came to visit my mother. I didn't mean to intrude." "Well, you have." Margaret rose to her feet with the dignity of a queen, brushing dirt from her knees. "This is private." Emily's gaze dropped to the small headstone, then back to Margaret's face. "I didn't know you had lost—" "Do not." Margaret cut her off, voice quivering with barely contained emotion. "Do not speak of things you know nothing about." The older woman gathered her handbag and straightened her coat, rebuilding her armor piece by piece before Emily's eyes. "I trust you'll have the decency to keep this to yourself," Margaret said. Not a request, a command. As she brushed past Emily, their shoulders nearly touching, Emily caught the faint scent of bourbon on her breath. Margaret, who had once lectured her about the vulgarity of women drinking anything stronger than sherry at family gatherings. Emily remained rooted to the spot long after Margaret's Cadillac had pulled away from the cemetery gates. The flowers for her mother's grave hung limply in her hand, forgotten. "The woman who rejected me my entire life," she whispered to the wind, "was crying alone for a baby no one knew existed." That night, as Daniel slept soundly beside her, Emily stared at the ceiling, the image of Margaret kneeling at that small grave playing on repeat in her mind. 6 years of hostility, of calculated slights and public humiliations, suddenly cast in a different light. For the first time since meeting her mother-in-law, Emily wondered if the hatred had ever truly been about her at all. The china teacup clattered against its saucer as Margaret set it down with unnecessary force. Emily tried not to flinch at the sound, or at the suffocating silence that had stretched between them for the past 10 minutes. "Daniel said you needed your blood pressure medication," Emily said, placing the pharmacy bag on the antique sideboard. "Your doctor called it in yesterday." "He shouldn't have bothered you," Margaret replied, each word precise and clipped. "I'm perfectly capable of handling my own prescriptions." Emily glanced around the immaculate living room, so unlike the warm chaos of her own home. Everything here was arranged with mathematical precision. The porcelain figurines displayed in locked glass cabinets, the dark oil paintings of scowling ancestors, the artificial flowers that never wilted, never died, never lived at all. The air smelled of furniture polish and emptiness. "It was no trouble," Emily said. "I was heading this way." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, detecting the lie. Emily lived and worked on the opposite side of town. There was no logical reason for her to be heading this way. "Well, you've delivered them. Thank you." Margaret lifted the teacup again, a clear dismissal. Emily didn't move. She'd rehearsed this moment during the entire drive over, had practiced the words, had promised herself she wouldn't leave without asking. "I saw you yesterday," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "At the cemetery." The teacup froze halfway to Margaret's lips. For a split second, raw panic flashed across her face before the familiar mask of composure slammed back into place. "I don't know what you're talking about." The small grave. The teddy bear. Emily took a deep breath. "The baby!" The teacup clattered back to its saucer, tea sloshing over the rim onto the immaculate white tablecloth. Margaret didn't seem to notice the spreading stain. "You had no right to spy on me." Her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I wasn't spying. I was there to visit my mother." "And decided to follow me instead? To invade a private moment?" "No, Emily stopped herself. She hadn't come here to argue. "I just want to understand." "Understand what exactly?" Margaret's voice was brittle as thin ice. "Was it your son? The baby?" The color drained from Margaret's face. "You should leave. Daniel doesn't know, does he? About having a brother who—" "Get out of my house." Margaret stood suddenly, her entire body trembling. "Now!" Emily rose slowly, knowing she had pushed too far, too fast. At the door, she paused, turning back to find Margaret still standing rigidly by the tea table, her eyes fixed on nothing. "Whatever happened," Emily said softly, "whatever pain you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." Margaret's response was barely audible. "This is not your business. This is not your family." "I am your family, Margaret, whether you like it or not." That night, after an unusually quiet dinner, Emily waited until Daniel was engrossed in his work before slipping into their bedroom. From the back of the closet, she retrieved the spare key that Daniel kept to his mother's house. For emergencies, he'd always said. This felt like an emergency of a different kind. The attic was exactly where Daniel had described it, accessed through a trapdoor in the ceiling of the upstairs hall closet. Emily's heart pounded as she climbed the folding ladder, painfully aware of her trespassing. The space was immaculate, like everything in Margaret's domain. Boxes labeled by year, by content, by purpose. Emily moved through them methodically, searching for anything from around the time of that tiny grave marker. She almost missed it. A small cedar chest pushed far beneath the eaves, nearly hidden by larger storage containers. Unlike everything else in the attic, it bore no label, no organizational marking. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay a baby's christening gown, delicate and perfectly preserved. Emily lifted it with reverent hands, tears springing to her eyes at the tiny proportions. A small matching bonnet was nestled beneath, and when Emily turned it over, she gasped. Embroidered in faded pink thread across the hem was a single word: Hope. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, tracing the name with her fingertip. "And why did she bury your existence along with you?" As she carefully replaced the items, her hand brushed against something hard at the bottom of the chest. A small photo album, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside, a single black and white photograph of a teenage Margaret, her stomach visibly rounded beneath a loose dress, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance as she stared into the camera. Emily closed the album with shaking hands, suddenly feeling the weight of her intrusion. This wasn't some petty family secret. This was profound grief, decades old, but clearly still raw. As she descended the ladder and carefully locked the house behind her, Emily couldn't shake the image of teenage Margaret, alone and pregnant, facing a world that had little mercy for girls in her situation. For the first time since meeting her, Emily wondered if she had completely misunderstood the woman who had become her mother-in-law. "She's having one of her good days," the nurse said, leading Emily through the sunlit corridor of Pine Meadows retirement home. "Just don't tire her out too much." Helen Vaughn was sitting by the window, her once elegant hands now gnarled with arthritis as they moved deftly across a half-finished knitting project. At 83, she retained the sharp blue eyes that smiled before her lips did when she recognized her visitor. "Emily, dear, what a lovely surprise." She set aside her knitting. "Daniel's not with you. Not today. Just me." Emily kissed the older woman's papery cheek before settling into the chair opposite her. "I brought those lemon cookies you like." Helen had been Margaret's closest friend for over 50 years. The only person Daniel's mother seemed capable of genuine warmth toward. If anyone knew Margaret's secrets, it would be Helen. They chatted about innocuous topics. The unseasonably cold weather, Helen's grandchildren, the book club selection Emily had brought on her last visit. Emily waited until the nurse had delivered tea before steering the conversation toward its true purpose. "I found something when I was helping Margaret organize some old things," Emily lied, pulling the photograph of young, pregnant Margaret from her purse. "I didn't want to upset her by asking about it." Helen's hands trembled slightly as she took the photo, her expression softening with recognition and what looked like old sorrow. "Oh, Margaret," she whispered, "still keeping your ghosts locked away after all these years. So you know about the baby?" Helen's eyes snapped up to Emily's face, suddenly wary. "She hasn't told you herself?" "No. I saw her at the cemetery, at a small grave." Helen was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the outline of young Margaret in the photograph. "It's not my story to tell," she finally said. "Please." Emily leaned forward. "I'm trying to understand her, to understand why she's always hated me." "Hated you?" Helen looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, child. Margaret doesn't hate you. She fears you." "Fears me? Why would she fear me?" Helen sighed deeply, the sound of someone releasing a burden carried too long. "Margaret was 17 when she got pregnant. Her family was prominent, traditional. When they found out, they sent her away to have the baby in secret." Helen's voice dropped to a near whisper. She wasn't given a choice about keeping her daughter. Daughter? Emily felt a chill run through her. Not a son? A beautiful baby girl. Margaret had named her Hope. Said it was all she had left after everything was taken from her. Helen's eyes grew distant with memory. She got to hold her just once before they took her away. 17 minutes, she told me later. She counted every second. Emily's throat tightened. She was forced to give her up for adoption? It was 1972. Girls from good families didn't keep babies born out of wedlock. Helen's voice held a hint of old anger. The boy's family paid for everything to be handled discreetly. Margaret never even told him she was pregnant. But the grave, empty. Helen's eyes filled with tears. Her parents told everyone she was at boarding school. When she came home, they never spoke of it again. But every year on the baby's birthday, Margaret bought a small toy and buried it in that plot she purchased herself. Said she needed somewhere to put her grief. Emily struggled to process this revelation. What happened to the baby? To Hope? Margaret tried to find her years later, but the records were sealed. All she knew was that the baby had gone to a couple who couldn't have children of their own. Helen paused, studying Emily's face with sudden intensity. Margaret always wondered if she had her eyes, her smile. Something cold slid down Emily's spine. Helen, when was the baby born, exactly? April 17th, 1972. Emily's birthday. Her hands began to shake. No, she whispered. That's impossible. But was it? Emily had always known she was adopted. Her parents had been open about that, had celebrated her chosen day every year alongside her birthday. But they had never had information about her birth mother, had told Emily the adoption had been closed, the records sealed. Does Daniel know any of this? Helen shook her head. Margaret married his father 5 years after losing hope. They adopted Daniel when doctors told them Margaret couldn't have more children, something about complications from the first birth. She never told anyone about Hope, not even her husband. Emily felt as though the room was tilting beneath her. My adoptive mother had red hair, like me. My father had my nose, my build. Everyone said I looked like them. Coincidence, perhaps, Helen said. But her eyes told a different story. Or careful selection by an adoption agency, Emily whispered. When she left Pine Meadows an hour later, Emily sat in her car without starting the engine, her mind racing through a lifetime of interactions with Margaret. The immediate dislike when Daniel first introduced them, the strange comment at their wedding, she doesn't belong in this family. Not a criticism, Emily now realized, but a statement of devastating irony. Most haunting of all, the moment 3 years ago when Emily had announced her pregnancy, and Margaret had gone so pale that Daniel feared she might faint. Emily had miscarried 2 weeks later. Margaret had sent flowers but hadn't visited, hadn't called. Emily had interpreted it as callousness. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. Grief layered upon grief. Too complex to face. She saw in me, Emily whispered to her reflection in the rearview mirror, a reminder of everything she lost. And that's why she hated me. The framed photograph of Daniel's 5th birthday crashed to the floor, glass shattering across the hardwood. You broke into my house? Margaret's voice rose an octave, her hands trembling visibly. You had no right. I needed to understand. Emily remained standing in the center of Margaret's living room, refusing to be cowed. And you weren't going to tell me. There's nothing to tell. Margaret bent to pick up the fallen photograph, hissing as a shard of glass sliced her fingertip. A bright bead of blood welled up, but she ignored it. My past is my business, not yours. I spoke to Helen. Margaret froze, the broken frame clutched against her chest. You had no right, she repeated, but the fire had gone out of her voice. April 17th, 1972. Emily took a step forward. I was born on April 17th, 1972. That proves nothing. Margaret's voice was barely audible. You think I hated you because you were stubborn or unsuitable. Emily continued, her voice breaking. But you hated me because I look like her, don't I? Like Hope. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Please stop. Like you. The broken frame slipped from Margaret's fingers, clattering back to the floor. She sank onto the sofa, suddenly looking her full 68 years and more. She would be your age, Margaret whispered, not looking at Emily. She would have your smile. She would have had everything I threw away. A terrible silence stretched between them. Did you know? Emily finally asked. When Daniel brought me home the first time, did you know who I was? Margaret shook her head. Not then, but I wondered. There was something in your laugh, in the way you tilt your head when you're listening, just like my mother used to do. She exhaled shakily. I told myself it was impossible, a coincidence. When did you know for certain? Your medical records, when you had pneumonia 2 years ago. Your blood type, that rare protein marker they found, identical to mine. Margaret's shoulders slumped. I've never told a soul about Hope. Not Daniel's father, not Daniel. Every year I visited that empty grave alone. Emily felt her own tears falling now. Why an empty grave? Because they wouldn't tell me where she was, where you were. I needed somewhere to put my grief. Margaret looked up, her gaze direct for the first time. That plot contains 47 birthday gifts, one for every year I missed. Emily sank into the chair opposite Margaret, the weight of revelation pressing on her chest. Does Daniel know any of this? No. And he'll hate me when he finds out. For giving up your baby? That wasn't your choice. For lying. For keeping you at arm's length when I should have embraced you as the miracle you were. Margaret's voice cracked. For being too much of a coward to tell you the truth even after I knew. When Emily arrived home that evening, she found Daniel in his study, glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed case files. He looked up with a smile that faded when he saw her expression. What's wrong? He was on his feet immediately, crossing to her. Is it Mom? Is she okay? Emily took his hands, leading him to the small sofa in the corner of the room. I need to tell you something. Something about your mother. About me. As the story unfolded, the discovery in the cemetery, the attic exploration, Helen's confirmation, and finally the confrontation with Margaret, Daniel's expressions cycled through disbelief, shock, anger, and confusion. He struggled for words. This is impossible. The timing fits. The medical markers fit. Emily squeezed his hand. Daniel, I think I'm the daughter she was forced to give up. But that would mean... He stopped, working through the implications. You're not actually related to her. She adopted me. Yes. And she knew, all this time? Not at first, but she suspected, and then she confirmed it. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the length of the study. She let me marry her daughter without telling either of us. What kind of person does that? A traumatized one, Emily said softly. Someone who buried her grief for so long she couldn't face it even when it walked back into her life. I grew up with a mother who never told me I had a sister. Daniel's voice was raw with betrayal. Who made you feel unwelcome in our family when you were actually more her family than I was? How am I supposed to forgive that? Emily had no answer. She watched her husband grapple with a truth that had rewritten his entire family history, wondering if the damage was beyond repair. After a long silence, Daniel asked, "What happens now?" Emily thought of Margaret alone in that immaculate empty house, of the tiny christening gown preserved for 47 years, of a mother whose grief had calcified into something hard and sharp enough to keep everyone at a distance. Now, she said quietly, we try to heal what's been broken for a very long time. Dawn light filtered through the cemetery's oak trees, casting long shadows across the dew-sparkled grass. Emily stood beside Margaret at the small headstone, neither speaking as birds called the morning to order around them. It had been 3 weeks since the truth had exploded their carefully constructed family narrative. 3 weeks of painful conversations, of tears shed alone and together, of Daniel's anger gradually giving way to a fragile understanding. Margaret looked smaller somehow, as if the unburdening of her secret had diminished her physical presence. Gone was the intimidating matriarch who had terrorized Emily for 6 years. In her place stood a woman worn thin by decades of silent grief. Emily placed her hand over Margaret's where it rested on the small headstone. It was the first time they had willingly touched in 6 years. Margaret's fingers were cold despite the warm spring morning. I used to come here and tell her about you, Margaret said softly, after I knew. I would sit here for hours, telling this empty plot about your accomplishments, your kindness, how beautifully you love my son. She paused. How much I wished I had the courage to love you. You can tell me those things now, Emily said gently. I'm right here. Margaret's hand trembled beneath hers. I don't deserve your forgiveness. This isn't about deserving. Emily turned to face her. This is about choosing to end the cycle of pain. They stood in silence as the sun rose higher, warming the cold stone beneath their joined hands. I have something to show you, Emily said finally. something important. The nursery in Emily and Daniel's home had stood empty and untouched since the miscarriage 3 years earlier. Emily had kept the door closed, unable to face the pale yellow walls and the crib that had never held a baby. Now, as she guided Margaret inside, she felt the older woman stiffen beside her. "Emily, I don't think—" "It's okay." Emily squeezed her hand. "Look." The room had been transformed. The walls were now a soft green, the crib replaced with a daybed piled with comfortable pillows. A small desk stood in one corner, a bookshelf filled with Emily's favorite childhood novels in another. Above the daybed hung a framed piece of needlework, the name Hope salvaged from the tiny bonnet Emily had found in the attic. "I can't have children," Emily said quietly. "The doctors confirmed it after the miscarriage. Something about my uterine lining, irreparable damage." She took a deep breath. "I kept the nursery closed because I couldn't bear to change it, to admit that dream was over." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Emily, I didn't know. No one did. Not even Daniel, not really. He knows the facts, but not how completely it destroyed me." Emily gestured to the transformed room. "But this isn't a shrine to what I lost. It's a reclamation. I'm making it my writing room, my sanctuary." "And the name," Margaret whispered, staring at the framed needlework. "A bridge between what was lost and what might still be found." Emily turned to face her birth mother. "I'll never replace the baby you lost, but maybe we can start again, build something new, even if it's late, even if it's hard." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand, tears flowing freely now. "You've given me more than I deserve. You gave me life," Emily said simply. "And now, maybe, we can both learn how to truly live it." That evening, as dinner preparations filled the house with the scent of roasting chicken and herbs, Emily watched Daniel and Margaret set the table together. Their interactions were still tentative, bruised by revelations neither had been prepared for. But they were trying. All of them were trying. "She called me this morning," Daniel said later, as he and Emily prepared for bed. "Before you picked her up for the cemetery. She's never called just to check on me before." "She's learning," Emily said. "We all are." "I'm still angry," he admitted. "But I'm starting to understand that she's been punishing herself far more than I ever could." Emily nodded, thinking of the woman who had spent 47 years visiting an empty grave, preserving infant clothing for a child she'd held for only 17 minutes. 2 months later, Emily stood alone at the small headstone, placing a bouquet of fresh roses against the marble. "She's doing better," she told the empty plot. "She smiles sometimes now. Real smiles that reach her eyes." Beside the original headstone, a new marker had been installed. This one read simply, "Hope, daughter, sister, inspiration to 2 women who found each other in grief and were reborn in love." Emily traced the words with her fingertip, feeling not the absence of what had been lost, but the presence of what had been found. The journey of healing had just begun, and there would be difficult days ahead. Margaret wouldn't change overnight. Decades of defensive walls wouldn't crumble in an instant. But for the first time, there was space for something new to grow in the cleared ground of truth, something tender and fragile and real. As Emily walked back to her car where Margaret waited to join them for Sunday dinner, she felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for years. Some wounds never fully heal, but sometimes, in the broken places, light finds its way through. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and give us a thumbs up. Thank you for watching.